I swear, y'all, it's like our students can smell our fear, especially when it comes to doing tough activities. So if you've been dreading and putting off teaching historical thinking skills in your classroom, you need to watch this. In this video, I'm going to go over how to prevent student resistance and student meltdowns when it comes to analyzing historical sources. I'm also going to show you how to package your activities so that your students are engaged every single time, as well as how to skillfully craft questions that your students feel confident enough to answer. So if you're excited to learn all this, be sure to hit the like button, be sure to hit that subscribe button so that more teachers who may be looking for these answers can actually see this video. And if you're new to this channel, hi, I'm Cecilia Temes. I'm an educator support specialist, and I help overwhelmed history teachers become confident facilitators of student-led and student-centered classrooms. So let's talk about phase one, planning. Now, one of the things that I've most often or frequently observed when working with teachers and in my own personal experience, especially when we're starting out, possibly again, because we don't know our curriculum that well or we don't have the guidance, I see sometimes that a lot of teachers actually invest too much time going into like an analysis evaluation of a historical event for every single topic in a unit. And the problem with that is you're wasting a lot of time and you're wasting a lot of energy, not because those topics aren't worth analyzing, but for most of us, if we are on a time constraint due to a test, due to AP exams, due to some sort of curriculum timeline we have to meet, you're going to be stressing yourself out teaching every single thing in depth when you don't really need to. So let's talk about that. I want you to look in your curriculum documents and look at the words that they're using with each content piece so that you know how in depth to go. So if they're only saying recall, you know that you don't need to go into some in-depth evaluation of that historical event. During this planning phase, it's also very important for us to actually stop and think about what questions we're going to need to be asking our students on our end, because we can't jump from a recall to an analysis. And we'll talk a little bit more about that later, because a lot of it also has to do with us asking the right questions. Now, in order to gauge your jumping point, the jumping point for your students, where they're at. Are your students able to answer recall questions about content? Are they able to explain content? Because this will determine where you need to start with your questioning. Now, oftentimes our students are actually not equipped and not ready to jump right into analysis questions. So what do we do? Well, in this first phase, in this planning phase, this is when we figure out the way to build that solid foundation so that our students can get there. So what do we do? Number one, you want to take the time to build background knowledge. I know that with all the curriculum that we have to cover, it often seems impossible to go back and maybe reteach some topics. You want to make the time to embed continual exercises that loop on prior knowledge so that your students are hearing it day in and day out. It could be trivia when they come into class. It could be exit questions. It could be anything, okay? Get creative, go wild on this. But that content needs to be looped continuously, okay? So we are building that background. The second thing you want to do if your students are just not ready to answer analysis history questions is you want to determine at what point do your students get stuck with their answer. And there are several ways to do this, but essentially, if you are having them do practice questions on paper, you want to make sure that you have your students justify their answer. Why did they choose that particular answer choice? If they're doing short answer questions or short answer practice, same thing. You want them, and of course it's required, right, to use textual evidence and literally show you their work, right? So that you know, okay, they do know their content, but they're still not getting the question. The problem is not their recall, okay? So having our students justify their answer, even when we're doing trivia or exit questions, just asking our students why will give us the insight that we need to know at what stage our students are needing additional support. And the third thing you want to do if your students are having trouble and they're just not ready for that analysis level, when you're planning, you need to also consider one very obscure detail, and that is whether or not your classroom is a safe space for your students to fail. That's right, I said fail. Because even if our students do know the answer, if your classroom does not give off, we're all here to learn vibes and nobody's perfect and I'm here to support you, then even if they do know the right answer, or even if they don't, you'll never find out because your students are too scared to try. They don't know if they'll be ridiculed in your class. They don't know if they'll be hit with the, you still don't know that answer. So we want to always make sure that our foundations are all set for being able to support our students to master this very complex social studies skill. Now, in our planning stage, it's also where we want to keep in mind or think about how we're going to differentiate and scaffold for our learners. So first, we need to know what those two things are, okay? Scaffolding is when you're providing an additional resource or support to ensure that your students can help themselves in responding. Differentiation is an adaptation of the original activity that will allow your students to practice the exact same skills, same questions, same everything, but meeting them where they're at. So there's a saying, I don't even know who said it, but it's something like, if you fail to plan, you plan to fail. So in this stage, we need to ask ourselves, how am I going to take this activity, this idea, this skill, and create an option to make this same activity or assignment accessible to all my students? So how am I going to accommodate this for my students that have trouble reading? How am I going to adjust this for students that don't have a strong foundation in recall? In the planning stage, this is where we troubleshoot and we break the patterns that we've been seeing in our class so far. So in the second phase of teaching historical thinking skills, we want to package our learning experience. Now, there's one cardinal rule for human engagement that you just gotta know, and that is never give it to your students cut and dry. Think about the way that we buy as consumers and get invested in products or experiences. You want this activity to be exciting for your students? Then sell it the way they buy it. And this means you gotta know your learners. Are they competitive? Can you make this a game? Can you make the lesson an immersive experience? A reader's theater? Can you give the activity a catchy title? Now, you want to pay attention to your students' body language when you first announce the activity. You want to try to drop like little hints, like the trailer to kind of build the hype. Now, even if it's a hard pill to swallow, their reaction will tell you if you need to tweak your packaging. Now, I know it may seem inconsequential, but the packaging of your lesson is the initial selling point that's going to help create student buy-in for lessening that resistance, to increase your engagement. And also it increases that feeling of student safety, right? When it's something that students see that you're passionate about, that you're hyped about, that you're giving off the energy of, hey, this is something fun, it's exciting. When students feel confident and safe, they are going to create less resistance, right? Because if something is fun and non-threatening, then there's really nothing to resist. There's nothing to be scared of. Now, this process, the planning and the packaging lessons, is actually something that I teach in detail in my paid teacher program, Teach Like an Influencer Academy. And if you're just looking for concise, reliable results to transform your teaching, check out the link below to get a completely free evaluation on whether or not you would be a good fit for this program. Now, every good teacher is also a good learner. So if you have any suggestions or ideas about how you have packaged your lessons creatively in the past to up your student engagement, I would love to hear about it in the comments below. Now, phase 3 for teaching social studies skills, we're going to look at preventing meltdowns, breakdowns, and resistance. So there's a quote that I posted on my Instagram page the other day. Truer words were never spoken. Confidence is rooted in competence, which means that the key to preventing resistance from our students is for them to feel competent in themselves, in us, and our ability, so that they can confidently participate and be intrinsically engaged. Now, I know sometimes we don't always have the time to create all our own resources and materials in order to scaffold and differentiate and really support our students the way we need to. So if you're looking for additional resources for teaching social studies skills, you're always welcome to visit my website at thegameplaneducasolution.com. Now, oftentimes in my experience, I feel like those students feel hesitation and resistance if one, they've not had enough time and exposure to the type of questions that they're going to be expected to answer, and two, we also may not be asking the right questions. Now, we talked about this a little bit earlier on in the video, but let me give you an example. If we routinely ask questions like, when did, who was, and then all of a sudden we're jumping to, why would, explain why type of questions, then your questions are actually not conducive to helping your students respond. I'll tell you what usually does happen though. Our students get frustrated. They'll shrug their shoulders and say they don't know, they give up. And then sometimes we give in and give students the answer, or we let that one student answer. So let's switch that up. Here's what we're gonna do. The first thing you wanna think about is, what questions do I need to ask in sequence to get my students to slowly climb to the question that I need answered? For example, let's say my question is, analyze whether the Declaration of Independence provides a valid justification for the American Revolution. So then I would think that the questions I need to ask on my end are, what does the Declaration of Independence do? So first, I need to see where my students at. Like, let's go back down to recall. Okay. And then, what does the Declaration of Independence say? Can my students explain something about it? What are some listed grievances in the Declaration of Independence? It gives them questions to chew on while they get to that top analysis question. So do you kind of see how I'm giving them smaller bite-sized chunks of the analysis question? So we're nibbling around it just to give students a starting point for their thought process. Because if I was to have just started with analyze the Declaration, they would draw a blank. And something that we mentioned during the planning process is scaffolding. So let me give you an example of what a scaffold for this particular analysis question would be like. So continuing with the previous example, scaffolding might look like making sure that my students know the learning outcome. That's one. Also, maybe allowing or providing the use of notes as they construct their response to these bite-sized questions. Providing additional thinking time, an organizer that will actually help them sequence all these ideas together. So these organizers shouldn't just be like a paper with boxes. It needs to visually demonstrate how all these ideas can help them feed their conclusion about the purpose of the Declaration and the American Revolution. Also, providing visual supports would be a great scaffold. Now, my differentiation, remember, differentiation is we're trying to make this same activity accessible to all our learners. So an adaptation of this activity, students are doing the exact same thing, answering the same questions, etc., might be allowing students to work on this in a collaborative setting. You can also structure this exercise in a way where students provide a response, but then their classmates can help clean up the answer, add to the answer, eliminate certain things, and just kind of peer review each other's responses. Modeling is also essential when it comes to teaching social studies skills. It's going to help prevent meltdowns and resistance. In order to help expose students to this response style and to this question depth at which they're expected to respond, and really help them feel like there is a reliable process or method to answer these questions no matter what they throw at you, it helps for them to see and hear you working out these answers aloud. It's going to be you verbalizing the answers to these baby questions. So we're still working with little baby questions that'll feed into our big analysis question. So you are demonstrating your thought process, or maybe you're even writing down a sample of what this would look like if you were answering for a short answer, a type of AP question or something like that. And as you're, compiling these answers, you want to make sure you point to the textual evidence that you're using, maybe notes that you provided your students that they could use in order to support their responses. And then even once you've responded, you yourself want to verbalize the justification. Now, I know what you might be thinking, like, well, show us how to model this for the students. Here's the thing. Every history teacher, some of you all have state assessments. Some of you all have, just benchmarks that you do on behalf of your district. Some of you all do an AP exam. So there is no one size fits all. Okay, you know what content area you teach, and you know what their assessment or their closing project or whatever it is your district has for those students. You know what that looks like. And if you don't, you definitely need to ask. but you want to base your modeling process on how your students will need to respond. So if they're going to be responding to multiple choice, then you need to model the process in a multiple choice format or example. Okay, so that means that you might have to model a little something extra, the process of eliminating and justifying why you're eliminating. If you do short answer responses for an AP exam, or you do essay responses for an AP exam, you might have to show them a written sample of an essay that you do and literally verbalize and sequence all the steps that are required, the thesis statement and support A, support B, support C, etc. So again, you want to ensure that your process that you model for students is based on the style of mastery that your students will need to have, whether that be multiple choice, short answer, project, etc. So you get the idea, right? When students have this big massive undertaking and they have it broken down into a proven system that their teacher has modeled for them 1,000 times, this level of question will start to feel a lot more accessible, more attainable. Students will get into the practice of first mentally breaking down the parts or pieces. After a while, they will know how to start breaking down some of the information that they need to be thinking about in order to build them up to answer that one big question. Aside from this, as I mentioned earlier, when you teach your students a process for tackling these questions, then it's ideal for us as teachers because we'll know exactly at what point our students get stuck, which is going to help you troubleshoot and modify your instructional methods. If you found this video helpful and you want to have access to more instructional resources, tips, insight, and other exclusive content sent straight to your inbox, be sure to enroll in my History Teacher Help Hotline newsletter down in the description below. For additional resources for your social studies instruction, be sure to visit my website, thegameplanedusolution.com. I want your success. I'm rooting for you. Until next time, class dismissed.